Hey pals, I'm here today to answer some of the questions you recently gave me in a video where I mentioned that I've been doing the channel for 10 years, and so I decided to take some questions. I was asked a lot of questions, thank you so much, really appreciate it. And so I'm going to do this in two parts. This part is all the bookish questions and the other part will be all the non-bookish questions. So I had some questions that were quite similar, so I've sort of combined those questions. So if you hear me read a question that doesn't sound like exactly what you ask, but similar enough, that is why. And also I apologise if I've missed any questions. I don't think I have, but there's a chance that somebody could add a question too late, and I've already started filming. So there we go. I have these notes here that Luna must have gotten hold of because yeah, she's clawed the corner off. Luckily she didn't rip any of the actual writing off. I've tried to put these questions in some type of order that makes sense, but I don't know how successful I've been, so we shall see. So the first question is, did I love reading at school, and how did my love of reading develop? So I have one brother who's 2 years older than me, one brother who's 7 years younger than me. My mum taught us all to read before we started school, and for some reason that led to absolute love of reading in me and not in my brothers. So neither of my brothers read. I think my older brother has read some books that became things like Game of Thrones. He's then read the books, but other than that, he doesn't read, and my younger brother doesn't read at all. I once offered him £50 to read some books when he was 11, and he never read them. £50 for an 11-year-old is quite a lot, and he still didn't work, so he clearly doesn't like reading. So yeah, it just happened for me that I really love reading, and my mum really loves reading as well. So like I said, that sort of rubbed off on me, but somehow not my brothers. I did love reading at school, and I was definitely one of those probably quite irritating, precocious children who is when you, at least in the UK, you are sent home with books in your book bag that are age appropriate in terms of the level of reading they think you'll be at. And I was 100% like a little madam and would march up to the teachers and say, "This is too easy for me. I'm reading chapter books. I don't want this." And my mum in the end had to sort of tell my primary school teachers that if I wanted to read books above my grade level, as long as they were for the school library, she was sure they were appropriate and I could read them and was allowed to. So I was that annoying child. I also once got a written warning in year 5, so I would have been 9 or 10, because I was in a maths class and I was reading an Animal Ark book under the desk. I was partway through the Animal Ark book, must have been reading it during breakfast, must have just been desperate to know what was going to happen next for the Badger or something, and was reading it under my desk, and the teacher looked over and asked me a question, didn't hear, was reading my book, and then she came over and made me get out of my seat, and obviously saw that I had a book, which is the geekiest thing to get a written warning for, isn't it? But it happened. So yeah, my parents really encouraged my love of reading to the degree where my mum, we've had this discussion recently, and she said it was quite a difficult thing because at the time when I was a child who loved reading, it sort of when Game Boys and stuff had come out, handheld game consoles, which my older brother loved. And so, there was a degree to which she wanted to restrict that, so he wasn't always looking at a screen. But at the same time, didn't feel like she wanted to restrict my reading because you should want to encourage your children to read. It's really educational and informative. And so she said she found that quite difficult. And so we had this agreement. I was allowed to read when we were in the car somewhere, so I could read the whole car journey. And say we were going out for a family dinner, I was allowed to read while we were waiting for the food to be served. But as soon as the food was served, I had to actually socialise, which I think is more than fair enough. And there's a story my mum always brings up when we laugh about how much of a geek I was as a child, where we were round a neighbour's house, sort of close family friends, and we were ordering a Chinese, and this was back when you went and collected your Chinese rather than getting it delivered. And I offered to go with our neighbour to pick it up, who was sort of the age with my granddad, so I sort of said, I'll go with you. And he was like, "Oh, that'd be nice to have some company." I read my book the whole walk, and then I read my book whilst we waited in the Chinese for our food, and then I somehow left my book there, and as soon as we got back with the food, was gutted because I thought I was not going to get my book back. So we had to make a panicked dash to get my book back before I had some sort of breakdown. Also, I remember as a child, I was such a geek. In my bedroom, I had a windowsill that was wide enough for me as a child to sort of perch on. And so, when you're a child and you have to go to bed before it gets dark in the summer, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, I used to hate that. And so I used to crouch on the windowsill with the curtain sort of wrapped around me and read until I literally couldn't see the words anymore. Like I would drag out as long as I could, but I always keep one ear listening to the stairs, because it was a bit difficult to sort of get myself off the windowsill without making a noise and get myself back in bed before somebody got up the stairs. So I always had to be sort of alert. I think I did get caught once, but yeah, I used to do that all the time. So the next question is, how has my taste in books changed since starting the channel? I think quite a lot, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, just age. I started the channel when I was 22. I'm now 32, so that's quite a big age change, obviously. And also, like I said, I was an absolute, I loved reading. I stopped reading, at the time it was just called teen fiction when I was a teenager, it wasn't called YA. I stopped reading that when I was about 15, and I pretty much stopped reading that because my local bookshop had free shelving sections for teens, and I pretty much read all the books I was interested in reading. So then I just sort of mooched over to the adult section to be like, well, what do I read next? So it was more like that I was sort of forced to progress maybe a bit younger than I would have done, just because of the lack of selection at the time, which is not the case now with teen fiction. There's like, a massive market behind that. And so, yeah, then I still read loads until I was about 18, and then I stopped reading at university. I didn't like being alone in the quiet when I was at university, so I had a house of housemates who I really got on with. We spent most of our time together, but when we weren't together, I would just watch TV and films like all the time and study, but not very often. So when I finished university, I got back into reading, and sort of a few months after getting back into reading, started the channel. So initially, I got quite swayed by what was being read on BookTube, which was YA and classics. So I read quite a lot of classics in my first couple of years of the channel. I also read a lot of YA that I did not enjoy. I dabbled in fantasy, which is something I always loved as a child, and I sort of stopped reading as a teenager. Yeah, and I probably read more like, I probably didn't really know the difference between commercial and literary fiction, so I probably just read whatever, and I probably enjoyed it to a similar degree. So there's books that I know I loved back then that I know I would probably not like at all now were I to read them. So yeah, I think my taste has become a lot more literary, and so I mainly read literary fiction, fantasy and memoirs. And also something that's changed because of BookTube itself is that I've become much more aware of the voices I'm reading when I'm reading, and I've become much more aware of like when things are handled poorly. I just think I've learned so much from different people on BookTube. There's so many different experiences out there, and sometimes, as a society, we're really just unaware of some people's experiences, and it takes you hearing somebody say something for you to be like, oh yeah, that is true, like that is the way those characters are always represented, or that is the way that sort of information is delivered, or yeah, you're right, I have just been reading lots of white men, which I definitely read a lot of when I started the channel. And so that's like the best thing about BookTube, that for me has been how much it's shaped my reading and how much more I get out of my reading now. So yeah, so it's definitely changed. Are there any books I wish I'd waited to read? I don't know, probably not, but there definitely are a couple of books that at the time I read them, didn't get out of them what I could have done if I were to read them now. Like an example is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I read that just before I started the channel. At the time, because I hadn't read for a few years, I found it really difficult to read. I could tell at the time that it was really well written, but I didn't really enjoy it. So, but I think were I to read that now, I could really love it. So that's sort of an example of something I probably read at a time when I wasn't quite ready for it. But I didn't really DNF books back then, so I finished them, and I think I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads because I could recognise its greatness but didn't particularly enjoy it. And I think that's a book, if I reread, I probably would really enjoy, so maybe one day. I'm still not that interested in the history of the royal family, so it's more like the topic that's putting me off picking that up than the writing style itself. The next question is, are there 3 books that have shaped or changed the way I think? Now, I don't think so, which maybe sounds bad. And the reason I don't think so is because I think there's probably quite a lot of confirmation bias here. I've always been very aware of my opinions, and I've always been very open to learning more about things I am passionate about or things I feel I should know more about. And so I seek out books that I think, let's say non-fiction, for example. I read a lot of non-fiction about social justice issues, and I don't read books where I think I'm gonna, like, for example, I wouldn't read a sort of right-wing author talking about like the housing crisis, because I know what they're going to say I will find offensive. I don't read. I don't think that that's going to challenge me in the right way. Okay, so I do try read books that are talking about topics I'm interested in, where I just think I could learn more and maybe think about these things in a more nuanced or even like more specific way. But I think those things haven't necessarily shaped or changed me because I was already on that trajectory to want to think about those things. So as close as I could get to answering this question is these 3 books, and I'm just going to quickly run through them. Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates really got me thinking when I read it about 8 years ago about this sort of capitalist construct of everybody thinking they have to work to earn as much money as they can, to be as successful as they can, even if it makes them miserable. It really made me, I think I was always somebody who was against that, in part because I'm lazy and I love reading and other hobbies so much that I resent any time spent working, but also because I hate the fact that we're all like, I hate the fact that the first thing someone asks you when they meet you is, what do you do? Like, it's such an awful question. I hate it. Like what you do is supposed to somehow represent who you are. Like, it doesn't. For very, very few people who are lucky enough to do something they love, it does, but for most of us it doesn't. And I think this book probably articulated that in a way I probably couldn't at the time. The next one is probably one of the sort of first books I would say I read about history and social justice issues, and this just really probably propelled me to read more books like that and to delve deeper into those topics, and that is The Inconvenient Indian, A Curious Account of Native People in North America by Thomas King. I loved this book. I mean, you can see how many tabs there are. I definitely need to reread this. It's absolutely amazing. And I read this as a real sort of beginner to the subject. This isn't something we speak about much in the UK. And so I found this really approachable. I'd be interested now if I read it, having read a lot bigger books that deal with this topic, whether I would be like, oh, okay, it was quite introductory. I don't know. But this really pushed me to want to understand much more about the subject and to not only read non-fiction about this topic, but to read fiction. So I love reading fiction by Indigenous writers. I think I tend to focus more on Indigenous writers from Canada, but I am trying to sort of broaden that. But this definitely sort of inspired me to find out more. And this next one is After the Eclipse, a memoir by Sarah Perry. Now, this isn't the Sarah Perry who wrote The Essex Serpent. This is an American author. And this is a memoir that basically, when the author was 11 years old, her mother was brutally assaulted and murdered in her home, and while Sarah Perry was sort of hiding in another room. So she heard the whole thing. And it took years for her mother's killer to be found and tried. But the book isn't about this guy being found, which so many of these books and these podcasts and these documentaries now are about. They're so focused on the killer and who the killer was and what might have made them do it and how somebody solved it and all this stuff. And, you know, everybody loves all the juicy details. This is completely about the victim. It's about who her mother was, the woman she was before her death, being like, and not representing her as this perfect person either, upholding sort of all of her, all of the wonderful things about her, but also her imperfections, and talking about the woman she could have carried on being, the mother she could have carried on being, and what a loss it was for Sarah Perry, but mainly what a loss it was for her mother. She was very young when she was murdered. And this book is a real discussion about our contemporary obsession with true crime, and how in the majority of these media about true crimes, we disregard the victim. We disregard how the victim's family might feel about our obsession with this grisly crime, and we really centre the killer, and sometimes we even go so far as to sort of have a cult following of a killer, or like romanticise them. I'm thinking of some of these like dramas that have come out recently, and I started to find that difficult, and I started to question my interest and everyone else's interest. And this book really cemented that for me, as me being like, yeah, I really do feel profoundly uncomfortable with this. There's a scene where Sarah Perry's at the gym and she's on a running machine, and she says there's TVs in the gym, and these TVs are just showing those sort of half an hour documentaries about crimes, unsolved crimes, and they're showing like all the grisly details. It's like daytime television in a gym. And she's saying it's to that degree where somebody like the author, who lives with, you know, an awful lot of PTSD for having lived through that, has to be confronted with that in just the most banal circumstances, because that's how we are as a culture. That's how much we normalise this obsession. So this really pushed me to question that, and I have really sort of disengaged from that whole type of content. Even though I completely understand why a lot of people find it fascinating, I think we really need to question how the victim or their family would feel about the representation of that. So yeah, this one really gave me a lot to think about, and I definitely need to reread it. I said I wasn't going to talk very long about those, and I fear I did. Any books I loved as a teenager not mentioned on the channel? Yes, absolutely loads. I am intending to do like a reading vlog where I reread some of my childhood favourite books, and they're probably books that I loved up until like, I probably read them first when I was like 9 to 12, but maybe kept rereading them even after that. So I'm definitely going to do that. But as a teenager, I really got into reading at the time, again, so different to how YA is marketed now. At the time, I read a lot of sort of sexy romance books that had a teen symbol on them to say that you could only buy them if you were a teenager. And I remember reading some of these when I was like 12 and getting one of my taller friends to go up to the counter to buy them for me. I'm sure they wouldn't have questioned our age, but I used to do that. And it's hilarious because I remember these books having like, graphic sex scenes for a, I mean, I was 12, but a 13-year-old was allowed to read them. And now those books would be classed as new adult for like, I don't know, what age range are new adults supposed to be? I don't know. But yeah, it's bizarre how much we've like changed the content we think teenagers should be reading, and we've like, I don't know, like we want them to be children for longer, but then in other ways, like with video games, the reverse has happened. I don't know. I always just think that's interesting. So like a book I loved and read loads was Junk by Melvin Burgess, which is a book about some heroin addicts, and it's very graphic. I remember there being a scene where a mother was breastfeeding and she injects heroin directly into her boobs because that's where the best veins are while she's breastfeeding, and I probably read that as like a 13-year-old. And that was in the teen section. Like that was, I wasn't not supposed to be reading that. So yeah, I love those books, and I think the author I loved was called Kate Can. I will see if I can find some covers and I'll dot them around me. But I read and reread her books. So that's the sort of stuff I was reading as a teen. When do I read? What time of day? How many hours? And what snack and or beverage? So I pretty much read in the evenings. Now, I wish I could get up earlier and read in bed. I always like lie in, and I don't even enjoy the lie in as much, and I should just get myself to sit up and read a book, but I don't. And very, very rarely that does happen. Like, for example, the other day I was reading a fantasy book I was really loving. I had one chapter left, but I was so tired. It was 1 a.m. I was like, I'm going to save this till the morning. And as soon as I got up, the first thing I did was reach and finish that chapter. And I really loved it, so I wish I did that more. But most of my reading takes place in the evening after work, and even at the weekend, I quite often have to do videos, and then I'll be editing those in the afternoon, or we play a lot of board games in the afternoons. So yeah, the vast majority of my reading happens in the evening. I would like to change that, but yeah, that is how I am currently. So when do I read and what time of day? Similar question. Yeah, I read the same amount in the evenings after work as I do at the weekends, probably, because it's still just evening reading. How many hours? Now, if I was answering this question based on this past week, I have been finishing my dinner and then reading for the rest of the evening. So I've probably been reading between 4 and 5 hours a night. But historically, I've got really bad, and I was reading like maybe only 40 minutes a day. I've got so into just like being on my phone and watching YouTube, and like as soon as I need to like look something up in a book, I'll look it up, but then I'll click on like Instagram, or then I'll click on like my library app or whatever. I'm really trying to get myself out of the habit of that. I'm on a roll this week and I want to continue that roll, so we shall see. What snack and or beverage? I like a mint tea. I love cake. I eat cake all the time. So yeah, I'm most likely to be eating cake and drinking like a tea or a mint tea, and then if not, just like water, I guess. That's not very interesting, is it? And then if it is a colder season, I will maybe be drinking a hot chocolate. Advice to get the most out of reading. Yeah, I guess off the top of my head, I would say to not look at your phone. And also, what I've really found in the last week is, having been in this rut where I have been reading very little so far this year, I found reading something like fantasy, where I did really want to know what was going to happen next, really has now got me in that mode of reading for several hours an evening. So now I've moved on to another book, which is still quite, compelling, and I do want to know what happens next. But now I just feel in the mindset to want to, as soon as I finish dinner, be like, right, I'm reading now for the rest of the evening. And so I think sometimes you need to like find that good book that gets you in that mode, and then like try and carry that swing on. Obviously put your phone down as much as you can, and yeah, maybe, I don't know, try not to be distracted. I don't think I'm very good at this advice because I've not been so good at following it myself the last year or so, but I'm trying. Any books that made me want to write? I'm going to combine these next 3 questions, okay, because they all made me think of the same thing. So any books that made me want to write, if I wrote in any genre, what would it be? And who would I want to write my life story if somebody had to? So memoirs make me want to write because I've never wanted to be a writer, but I adore memoirs, and something I am fascinated by is memory and different people's versions of a memory. So I have a really bad memory of significant portions of my childhood and even my teen years and early 20s. Like, I mean, Johnny and I have been together since we were 16. And quite often he'll be like, oh, do you remember this day? And I'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And like, it didn't even happen that long ago. So I've got quite a poor memory. And so, yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by memory. I find it really interesting in a memoir when someone will say, this is what I remember, but I spoke to my sibling and they're like, that isn't how it happened, this is how it happened. I'm interested in what it means about a person that they remember it differently, and if their version of it sort of represents who they are, I don't know. And yeah, and to be honest, the other reason I'd go memoir is because I don't know if I could ever write fiction, because I just feel like obviously everything hasn't been done, but I fear that because I'm such a big reader, I feel like any idea I would have, I'd be like, oh, but that happened in that book, so I feel like I'm stealing. So I think I'd find that really hard to not feel like I was plagiarising people, even though it might not be intentional. And like, you can't plagiarise with a memoir because it is literally your story. And then for who I'd want to write my memoir, I would choose T. Kira Madden. She wrote Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, and I absolutely adore her writing. And out of all the books I read, it was the one where I was like, if I was any good, this is what I feel like I would aim for. This is the stuff in my head that I can't properly articulate. Like, this is the way I think I could put it down on paper if I was any good, which I'm not. So please don't read that book and think I'm saying I could write like that, because I can't. But I feel like if I could pull all the straws together and suddenly become a great writer, then that's the way I'd want to relay my life. Does that make sense? I also love how nostalgic her writing is, very beautiful and detailed, and I love what she has to say about girlhood, about the friendships you have as a teenage girl and how all-encompassing they feel, and how things that happen when you're 12 or 13 feel like the end of the world, and when you look back as an adult they feel like such a small thing. I just think there's a real beauty to her writing, so yeah, I would have her write my life. She'd probably find it boring. Do I have a budget for book buying? No, not really. And that makes it sound like I'm absolutely loaded and I'm just like, whoa, like buying everything. That is not the case. It used to be, not that I was absolutely loaded, but that I used to buy a lot when I first started the channel. But I'm trying to keep a zero TBR right now, and so I am literally only pre-ordering books where I've previously loved something from the author and I know I definitely want to own it, and I think it's likely I'll give the book 4 or 5 stars. That's it. So at the moment I have one book I'm waiting to come on pre-order, and then after that, nothing. Like there's a few books that I want to pre-order for the next 3 months, maybe like 3, and other than that I probably won't buy anything. So I don't need a budget because like I'm barely buying anything. But I think back when I used to buy a lot, this is like I say, years ago, sort of maybe the first 6 years of my channel was like my peak. I was probably, I don't know how much I was spending, maybe £60 a month was my average, but then I would ask for a lot of books for Christmas and my birthday, so a lot of my intake of books were gifts. So yeah, maybe back in the day £60 was my limit, but now I don't have one because like I probably spend like £10 or £15 a month, which is absolutely fine. Do I compile notes while reading, for my videos? No, not at all. I never mark a book. I like sometimes put sticky notes on my favourite pages, things like that, but I never write anything. Incredibly rarely, I reckon in all the time I've done this channel, I think like 700 videos, maybe even more, I don't know. But I would say that I have written a sort of script for less than 10 videos. Tend to be more likely to do it when I'm talking about memoirs or non-fiction, because I have a much more of a fear of saying something incorrect, or like misrepresenting like someone's like race or something. Like that's always a fear I have. So those are the videos I would be more likely to write a script. But no, I think so much more whilst reading than I would have ever done were it not for the channel. And I notice things down to a really tiny detail, I think because I, again, not read for a channel, but know that all my reading will be spoken about here. So it's really trained me to think in a certain way when I read. So oftentimes I will be reading and think, oh, that's made me think that. I'll probably, that might be something I say in the video, but I don't write that down. Maybe I should. But I feel like that would maybe like take me out of the moment of reading and would make it feel more like I'm some sort of professional book reviewer, which I am not. So I need to be making a lot more money from the channel than I am to want to write essays on everything I read, or not essays, but even to take notes. Too lazy. So any videos I wish I hadn't uploaded? Yes, and there are a few videos that in the last year I've made private. Now, I am very, as a person, I'm very vocal in my opinions. I'm not backwards and coming forwards. I'm very upfront with people. Most of the things, if I say something behind someone's back, I'm usually likely to be willing to say it to their face. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, right? So I'm usually quite okay about vocalising my opinion. That's a very scary thing to do on the internet, because some people, firstly, I find when you do a negative review, especially of a popular book, you get people come across your channel who've never watched your channel before and therefore have no sort of relationship with you as a YouTuber, and therefore don't like or dislike you. And so they're just going to be a bit rude in the comment because they're like, well, fuck it, like I don't know this person and what they've said I disagree with. I also find you get a lot of people telling you you haven't understood the book, which I find incredibly patronising and is not correct. Trust me, there has never been a time when someone has commented and said, I don't think you understood the book, where I actually agreed with them. Like, I've always understood the book. And I'm not saying there aren't some books I don't understand. I avoid reading those books because I know I wouldn't understand them. But some of the books I've been told I don't understand are like, it makes me laugh, because I'm like, if you think I don't understand this book, if you think the book is complex enough that I don't understand it, then you clearly think the book is way more complicated than I do, because it isn't. So yeah, there's that. But the reason I've taken some of these videos down is because it is a bit tiring when a video you made 6-7 years ago still gets people having a go at you. Like, I just can't be bothered with it. Like, I just think, oh. And there are a couple of videos where I feel that I didn't necessarily, maybe I should have had a script, because I didn't articulate myself very well. And I don't think I necessarily worded things. I think probably I am a bit more sensitive to the way in which the things I say could be interpreted, and so the current me wouldn't have said those things. And so yeah, there's a couple of videos you may notice I get messages sometimes saying, I'm looking for your video on A Little Life and it's no longer available. Where is it? It is private, because the person I am now would not have worded some of the things in the way I worded it in that video. I still think that book is incredibly poorly written, but yeah, some of the things I said I think I didn't word brilliantly. So the next question is, leading on from that, which book is worse, A Little Life, Uprooted, or The Natural Way of Things? This person clearly has watched my channel for a lot of years, because those are three of the books I like really hated over the years. And actually, even though I really hate A Little Life, I think Uprooted is the weakest of those, because I think that Hanya Yanagihara, who wrote A Little Life, and Charlotte Wood, who wrote The Natural Way of Things, didn't write their books well. And my reasons for those individually, for A Little Life, let's do a re-review of it that I will leave uploaded, but a very short version. In the video I uploaded, I said that I found it unbelievable that somebody would have that many awful things happen to them in their life. I take that back, and I had a lot of comments saying, you know, you must have had a very wonderful life that you don't believe all those awful things could happen to one person. I completely agree. All those awful things could have happened to one person. We live in quite a horrible world. And I also completely agree with some of the comments where people said, like, if somebody becomes a victim of sexual abuse, sometimes those people are more likely to be preyed on by sexual abusers, which completely makes sense, right? But what I stand by is that I think Hanya Yanagihara didn't make me believe that all these things would happen to Jude, because she was so clearly present as like the master puppeteer, being like, now I'm going to do this horrible thing, and this is exactly how I want you to think about it. And now you're supposed to be sobbing, and now you're supposed to be saying it's the saddest book you've ever read, and isn't it heartbreaking? And so I didn't think her writing was strong enough to sustain a story with that many upsetting things in it, because it's bizarre to me, because I hear a lot of people say they found that book really emotionally affecting, and I sort of still feel offended by it, because I feel like she really didn't take enough care, I don't think, with writing those characters and those type of events. It does still to me feel a little bit like trauma porn, just because I don't think her writing style handled it well enough. So that's my thoughts on that. But the plot itself, like logically makes sense, okay? And the same can be said for The Natural Way of Things. The plot itself logically makes sense. I still don't understand what Charlotte Wood's message was with that book, because people kept saying it was like a really feminist book, and to me it felt anti that, and I still feel the same way about that. But Uprooted by Naomi Novik is poor in every regard, right? It's poorly written, the characters are really bad, the dialogue is awful, the romance makes no sense. He's an awful person, he says horrible things to her, you're supposed to root for them. But then sort of the final third, maybe quarter of the book is a mess of plot. I had no idea what was going on. I was rereading these sections. There's sort of a section when she's like running through the woods, I think, and it was like she just broke all the rules of her own magic system, or like there were no rules. And I hate that in a fantasy book, when the author like the magic never really made sense. Yeah, I just think like that book for me is the weakest of the three, because there's loads of things I have questions about that aren't about the writing style or the character development, but about the actual like mechanics of what actually happened in the book and whether those things were possible within the sort of rules of the author's magic system. So I just think that book was an absolute hot mess. So that is my worst of the three. The next question is, do I have any thoughts on e-readers? Not really. I have one. I got it a couple of years ago when I was having quite bad problems with my hands and I was struggling to hold books. I don't love using it. I don't know, there's something about holding a book physically, but I do think e-readers are really great for accessibility reasons. They're also great for space, and yeah, they're really good for sort of borrowing books and also being able to read books that are published in other countries without paying like a ridiculous amount for them. So there are definitely lots of good things about e-readers, but I still really love reading physical books. Then, do I have a favourite classic novel? I'm unsure about this really, because I sometimes think when people say that they mean like old school classic, whereas I definitely much prefer like, you know, what I would class as like a modern classic. So, you know, a book like Revolutionary Road, and you know, there's plenty of others I could name. But if I'm thinking about like a classic, which I think this question maybe means, I think maybe North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell is probably up there as one of my favourites. I really enjoyed Jane Eyre at the time I read it, but I think I'd probably have quite a few issues with that book were I to reread it. There's quite a few other classic books I read that don't stand out to me as much as North and South did. I really liked the discussions on class in that book, so it would probably be that, but like it's been a lot of years since I've read a lot of these books, so it's not that confident an answer. Am I a fan of Jane Austen books? Not massively. I've read Pride and Prejudice, really enjoyed it. Persuasion, didn't enjoy it that much, but I think I would now if I were to reread it. And I just haven't, I'm not wanting to read her books. But right now, I don't feel more compelled to read her books than I do to read like hundreds of other books, right? So I will probably give more of her books a go in my lifetime, but I'm just not really in that mindset right now, but I want to read those types of books. Then I've got favourite authors, and the favourite books as the reader I am now. These are quite big questions. So I did a video quite a few years ago now, where I went over all the books I had said were favourites previously since having the channel, and sort of said which ones I thought were like the ultimate favourites. I uploaded that video probably 4 years or more ago now, but I had a look at it when I got this question, and I think a lot of that still holds strong simply because I haven't reread those books. And so yeah, I think were you to like look at that video and then the books I've recently mentioned as favourite books of the year, that's probably a good representation of the types of books I'm really enjoying. I feel like I can't answer that type of question in this type of video because it needs to be a video all by itself, and I need to put much more thought into it. I probably need to have reread a lot more books, but yeah, I think it's probably, like I said, looking at that video and like other recent favourites is probably like a marker of the reader I am now and the type of books I really love. Favourite authors is probably an easier one to answer. I absolutely love Sarah Waters. I think she's an absolutely amazing writer. I also really love Sarah Moss. I've had a couple of her books that I felt were a bit more like misses than hits, but the ones I love, I really love. Then Mira Jacob only has 2 books out, but I really love both of them. There's a lot of authors where I've read like 2 books and really love them, but I'm always like, can you call someone a favourite author when they've only got 2 books? I'm making my way through Tayari Jones' books and really loved a couple of those. I have read quite a few of Liz Moore's books and love those. I feel like I need to like look at my bookshelves. Can I see books behind me? Don't know if I can. But yeah, I definitely again would need to like properly think, but the first author who comes to mind will always be Sarah Waters, so that should probably be my answer. And then I have a couple more questions, I think. So authors who I've read lots of their books but don't consider a favourite, I have 2. And that's Maggie O'Farrell and Anne Patchett. And the reason for this is that I was tricked. I read 1 or 2 of their books first and loved them. So then thought, okay, I must really enjoy this author. I will now try to read all of their books. And then hasn't worked out for me. So with Anne Patchett, I read Commonwealth and really loved it. And I also read her essay collection, her first one, and really enjoyed it. But then following that, I read Bel Canto, had some issues with that one. That was a bit weird. The Dutch House, really didn't like. And then what's it called? The Magician's Apprentice, something like that. Like a 3-star read. Like there was elements I really liked, elements I really didn't like. So yeah, I've not had a great hit rate, but I like really loved. And then I DNF'd her new essay collection. Really didn't, and I think I probably would, if were I to reread her first essay collection, maybe feel the same. So yeah, sort of read quite a few of her books, even though I only really love Commonwealth. Then Maggie O'Farrell, I read Hamnet and one of her first books, which I really loved. And then I carried on reading her books in publication order and thought they were all pretty bad. So My Lover's Lover is like really weak. The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, I had for years thought I would really love and didn't. Instructions for a Heatwave, whatever. So yeah, I will not continue to try their books, but I do, when I think I will love an author's work, I do try and read them all, but sometimes, you know, it's not always a success. Yeah, so popular authors whose books I've tried reading but I've decided aren't for me. Again, that could probably be a whole video, so maybe I will do a video on that. Let me know if you would be interested. Any authors you would give another go. Yeah, every now and again I look back on, I definitely want to try Hilary Mantel more, maybe not the Thomas Cromwell series. I think maybe I might try something else, like one of her standalones. And every now and again I think about a few books where I'm like, oh, maybe I should retry that now I'm a different reader. But I think usually I'm pretty sort of certain when I give up on a book, I'll give it a low rating, and it would take a lot to convince me otherwise. And then last two questions, what books have I reread and liked less the second time round? I can't think of a single one because I haven't really reread in the last 10 years. And so I can't remember doing that as a sort of teenager and liking a book less the second time round. And then lastly, what novel did I want to be on the Women's Prize? I'm not gonna do Women's Prize content because I think I might do the Booker long list this year. I just feel like I wish the Booker was all women, because I predominantly read books by women. I find them more enjoyable, more interesting, but I think for me the Women's Prize leans a little bit more commercial, and a lot of the books that have previously been nominated that I've read I haven't really enjoyed. Every now and again there is one I enjoy, but in general I think the reader I am now probably leans more towards the sort of books that the Booker Prize pick. So I might do that. So I didn't have massive opinions on the Women's Prize, because when I had a look at all of the books that were, all the books I had read that were eligible, I hadn't read many at all. And I think because I DNF'd loads, I had a look at the books I'd read and I was like, oh, there isn't really many I would even be that bothered about seeing on the list. And then I had a look at all the books I DNF'd last year and realised I DNF'd loads of eligible books. I don't think I've read any of the books on the long list from memory. And it's a list of three thirds. It's a list of thirds for me. There's about 5 or 6 books I already wanted to read. Then 5 or 6 books that I hadn't really heard of but sound like I'd be up for reading them. 5 or 6 books I'm not interested in at all. So yeah, I'm afraid that's a bit of a non-answer. But yeah, I don't think I'd read anything that was eligible that I'm sort of gutted isn't on there. Which is odd, because I feel like I read quite a lot of more recently published fiction, but the ones I've read more recently haven't been published in the UK, so they're not eligible. So yeah, the books that I would be that's a book written by a woman in the last year that I loved isn't eligible for the Women's Prize anyway. So yeah, this video has taken so long. I have no idea how long this is, but I fear we're getting on close to 45 minutes, which is atrocious. But thank you so much for all the questions. I hope you enjoyed the answers. Feel free to have a chat down below in the comments and answer any of the questions yourselves as well. Did any of you ever get told off at school for reading too much? I'd love to know all your geeky child reading stories. And yeah, thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.